Dear colleagues, I'm sad to share with you that Peter Germann died on December 6, 2020 in Bern, Switzerland. We're gathering in this talk to honor him and to celebrate his legacy and the wide range of contributions to the physics of soil-water interactions and flow. Peter was no stranger to EGU, and many of you may know him and have met him in this session or others. For those of you who did not have the pleasure of knowing or interacting with Peter, I'm sure you will recognize his name on the classic and highly cited 1982 review paper in Water Resources Research on macropores and water flow in soils, along with Keith Beven, his career-long collaborator and friend. This paper was my companion along my personal PhD journey when I studied preferential flow paths. Peter was a strong advocate for a reconsideration of the physics of water flow through soils, and in particular, for the limitations of the Darcy-Buckingham-Richard flow theory. Peter later developed the kinematic wave approach into a theory of viscosity rather than capillarity, dominating film flows subject to Stokes' law during infiltration. Peter summarized his research work in his 2013 book on the subject, published by the University of Bern. In a few words, Peter gave me a roadmap for an entire career that I'm looking forward to. He said, infiltration without a priori definition of pores, and sent that to me along with his precious book following series of discussions we had on integrating our models for improved modeling of flow. I now feel lucky to having inherited yet another copy of Peter's book, which he sent to Don Nilsson here at UC Davis, who, when he retired, gave to Jan Hopman, who then gave to me. In reaching out to many of Peter's friends and collaborators, many wanted to share their testimonies with enthusiasm and in fond memory of a great friend and collaborator. As I continue my short introduction, you will see those on the screen and get a feel of the great respect and admiration that Peter had. For those of you who knew Peter, you will miss his enthusiasm, his critical mind, his genuine care for the state of soil physics, his thoughtful responses, and his humor. He was a great source of inspiration to us and many others. Peter will be missed by many in soil science. And without any further ado, it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Keith Beven, Peter's career-long collaborator and friend.
So thank you for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to give this video tribute to Peter Germann. He was a friend and a colleague for some 40 years until his untimely death last December. I'm sure his name will already be known to many, if not all of you, for his work on preferential flows in soils. But you may not know some of the background to that work. My first meeting with Peter came about when I was working at what was then the Institute of Hydrology in Wallingford in England. In about 1977 or 78, after finishing his PhD thesis at ETH, Peter obtained an overseas postdoc position from the Swiss National Research Funds. And he sent a proposal to look at preferential flows to the Institute of Hydrology, where there was a soil physics section. It circulated around the soil physics section for some while, but did not actually generate any interest. So it was then sent to the modelling section and eventually ended up on my desk. I was very enthusiastic because I already had both field and modelling experience that preferential flows might be important. So I made a case to the director to support the visit. And sometime in January 1979, I first met Peter, his wife Dorothy, and their two then rather young children, Andreas and Daniela, in the entrance foyer of the Institute of Hydrology. I took him out to my field site. He walked me through his thesis data. We also set up some undisturbed column experiments and started to think of ways by which we might model preferential flows in soils. If I remember correctly, it was Peter who suggested integrating over films of different thickness in various geometries and macropores, and I who suggested that this could be represented as a single bulk kinematic wave equation, which I had then already been using at the hill slope scale and for routing in channel networks. We got a lot of work done in a few months, but it did not get written up straight away, mostly because I went and got myself offered a job at the University of Virginia and moved out there in the September of 79. As it happened, the department at UVA were looking for another hydrologist starting in 1980, so I suggested to Peter that he apply. He was also successful, and we had another 2 years at UVA together. The first 3 papers on the work that we published together appeared in the Journal of Soil Science in 1981. They generated a lot of resistance from traditional soil physicists, particularly in England from the group at Rothamsted. It might be difficult to appreciate now how much antagonism there was to such ideas then that seemed to undermine the Richards equation. We then published the review paper in Macropores and Water Flows in Soils in Water Resources Research in 1982. That paper still gets 70 or 80 citations a year, even after 40 years. We did mark the 30th anniversary of the paper by a Macropores and Water Flows in Soils revisited paper in 2013. And in fact, that latter paper included a photograph of a dye experiment we did at the Grendon Underwood site at Wallingford in March 1979. Rhodamine dye sprinkled on the surface got to a mould drain at a depth of about 60 centimetres in about 45 seconds. And that was at the end of winter when all the cray cracks should have been closed. Destructive sampling showed that the cracks were still transmitting water, as you can see in the photo. While we were at Virginia, I took another look at Peter's thesis data. This was a rather remarkable study for its time for the water relations in a forested slope on the Rietholzbach catchment in Switzerland, based on maintaining a network of 35 nests of tensiometers at 10 different depths down to 3 meters, set out on a triangular grid with 1.5 meter spacing amongst the trees. My contribution was to calculate variograms for the different dates and different depths. Variograms were very fashionable at that time, and I calculated something like 4,500 variograms for the different layers and dates. There were no on-screen graphics then, so they were output as line printer plots on 4,500 sheets of paper. And Peter and I found that you could have any shape of variogram you could possibly think of, from all nugget variants to continuously increasing, to continuously decreasing, to absolutely triangular in shape. So that fitting any form of common function was not really an option. And that was another piece of work that never got published. While we were in Virginia, we also collaborated with George Hornberger and Jim Galloway on the Shenandoah Watershed Acidification Project, which involved hydrology and water quality monitoring on 2 catchments in Shenandoah National Park to the west of Charlottesville. This was the time of significant funding for acid rain work in the US. We found plenty of macropores in the forest soils there and in the valley bottom gravels. Peter and George also managed to get funding for a tracer experiment in Maine, and I was able to go out there to help them with the field work. We discovered there were soil pipes in those forest soils and even had to install some collectors for pipes that crossed the slope to the boundaries of the plot. Peter's description of field soils in terms of the Swiss cheese principle definitely held there. Peter later developed the kinematic wave approach into a theory of viscosity-dominated film flows subject to Stokes' law during infiltration. While he sometimes glossed over some of the issues in applying it, he justified the approach with a variety of experimental data, and it does have the really important advantage of dealing with bypassing and preferential flows without having to specify anything about pore scale geometry. And some of that research was brought together in the book on preferential flows that he compiled after his retirement, which was published by the University of Bern in 2014. In the book, he gives an exposition of the theory in terms of wetting and drying waves, and in part 2 demonstrates how the approach is supported by both the field and laboratory evidence using a variety of techniques. Peter was a careful experimentalist and made use of a variety of time domain reflectometry, sonic wave and tracer experiments to study preferential flows. His thoughtful and good-humoured approach to collaborations, discussions and presentations was greatly respected and will be missed by many in soil science. And I'm sure that in future, people will come back to his work again and again as they try to grapple with the complex problems that is water flow in field soils. That's a good legacy to have left. I leave you with the memory of Peter and a couple of links that you might want to chase up. Thank you.